Welcome to the HyperIP configuration video. In this video, you will learn to define HyperIP sites, add intercepts to control traffic optimized by HyperIP, set bandwidth rates to manage WAN throughput, and verify your HyperIPs are ready to optimize traffic. This video assumes you have followed the Hyper-V or VMware installation video to create HyperIP virtual appliances, filled out the HyperStart configuration worksheets, completed the initial configuration, the browser access to the HyperIPs is available, and you have installed your HyperIP keys. If you have not requested keys and need to know how, please review the HyperIP installation video or HyperStart guide. The previous video configured HyperIP onto the network. During this video, we will complete the system configuration. Connect to the HyperIPs using a browser. This video will show a basic HyperIP configuration. Refer to the browser help pages or the HyperIP user guide for more information regarding the user interface and available parameters. Navigate to the system configuration page. Some of the information on the system page was set during the installation video. The system configuration page consists of 4 sections. Enter the data gathered in the HyperStart configuration worksheets in the appropriate area and click on the Apply button at the bottom of the section. The right-hand panel will show results. I'll add a DNS server and domain name in the host configuration section and apply. Since I'm only using the data port, I will disable the management interface by checking Disable and applying the change. Define the types of user connectivity allowed to this HyperIP by checking the boxes in the Access Control section to allow or disallow access. Checked boxes are allowed. Apply any changes by clicking Access Apply. If changes were made on this page, check pending restarts and perform the required restart. To check required restarts, select Show Pending Restarts in the Services drop-down menu and click Service Apply. Any restarts will be displayed. Select the required restart in the Services drop-down menu and click Service Apply. Confirm the restart. Complete the system's configuration page and any restarts on all HyperIPs before continuing to the HyperIP sites portion of this video. A site defines a particular HyperIP or a pair of HyperIPs running Automatic Hot Standby or AHS. To configure HyperIP sites, navigate to the Site Add Delete page. In this video, we are configuring HyperIP Marge. The required information from your configuration worksheet is the site name and data port IP address for this HyperIP, the site name and data port IP address of the remote HyperIPs. Always enter the site information for the HyperIP being configured in the first line and each remote HyperIP or AHS site in the subsequent lines. Site number is a unique identifier for this HyperIP or AHS pair. The number can be anything between 1 and 99. I'll use site number 6 for Marge. All additional HyperIPs must use site number 6 when defining Marge in their configuration. Site name is used to identify each site and is shown in displays and configuration drop-down menus. The primary IP address is the data port address of the HyperIP being configured. For Marge, this is 10.1.6.135. The virtual IP address, ID, and secondary IP are only required when configuring AHS. We will leave those blank. Seg size and max rate only affect remote sites, and we will leave those blank also for Marge. I'll use site number 5 for Homer. All HyperIPs must use site number 5 when defining site Homer. The IP address for a remote site is that HyperIP's data port address. For site Homer, that is 10.1.5.134. Seg size is the amount of user data that will be sent in a single transport packet between HyperIPs. We will leave that blank for now. Max rate limits the speed of traffic from this HyperIP to the remote site HyperIP. It is only required if there are multiple remote sites. We'll leave this blank and control the rate using bandwidth schedule or the keyed limit. Note when configuring multiple sites, the aggregate rate limit for all remote sites cannot exceed this HyperIP's key limit. Enter the site number of this HyperIP in the Configure this unit as site number window. Marge as site number 6. Select this HyperIP's function. For our configuration, that is no AHS. Apply the configuration. This will take a couple of minutes to complete. Verify the information is correct and all HyperIPs have been configured. Check and execute any pending restarts. The sites are configured halted by default. To start the sites, go to the HyperIP configuration page. In the Start Halt Remote Sites area, select the remote sites and click Start Sites. Follow the same process to add sites in the remaining HyperIPs. You can also use this HyperIP's configuration information in the remote HyperIPs by using the following process. Navigate to the Site Edit Import page. Highlight and copy the configured site information. Go to the Site Edit Import page on the remote HyperIP. In my configuration, Homer. Paste the information. Select this HyperIP site number and function. Homer is site number 5 and no AHS. Click Site Apply. Confirm the apply. Verify the information is correct and all HyperIPs have been configured. Check and execute any pending restarts. Complete the site configurations in all HyperIPs before moving to the Manage Traffic portion of this video. Go to the Proxies and Intercepts page. HyperIP software must be running to configure proxies and intercepts. If you have not installed keys, do so now. Proxies set up a one-to-one mapping of a local virtual address on the HyperIP to a remote IP node. Intercepts work as a filter to determine what traffic will be included in the HyperIP tunnel. Refer to the user manual for more information on proxies and intercepts. In this configuration, I'll be using intercepts. Intercept ID is a unique identifier to this HyperIP's proxies and intercepts and can be 1 to 8 characters. The drop-down contains the destination site for traffic matching this intercept. Any traffic that matches this intercept will be sent to site Homer. Source and destination IPs define the traffic that will be intercepted. The source IP address is a host or network on the same side of the WAN as this HyperIP. The destination IP address is a host or network on the other side of the WAN. An IP address can be wildcarded on a byte boundary using an asterisk. A blank port entry includes all ports for the configured IP address. The Protocols drop-down menu lets you control whether this intercept will apply to ICMP, UDP, TCP, or a combination of these IP protocols. Forward at limit determines whether to forward or drop a new connection if the HyperIP has reached the connection limits defined on the HyperIP configuration page. See the user guide for more information on how forward at limit and the HyperIP page settings work together. Enter the information for this intercept. Add any additional intercepts. Apply the configuration. Verify the intercepts are added. A similar intercept is required in the remote HyperIP. In the remote HyperIP, the source and destination IPs will be reversed to reflect the local and remote networks or hosts for that HyperIP. Configure the rate schedule to control the speed HyperIP will send data to remote sites by navigating to the bandwidth schedule page. In the right frame, select the day, month, date, start and end times for this entry. Fill in the megabits per second. I'll use 20 megabits per second to site Homer. Select the remote site and add rule. If multiple bandwidth table entries overlap, the highest number entry will be used. You can check which rule is in effect at the top of the page. Refer to the HyperIP user guide for more information on configuring time of day rate limiting. Navigate to the Advanced Config page. Traffic being accelerated and to the remote HyperIP must use the data port. If the default gateway is not on the data port, add a route to the remote HyperIP. You may also need to add routes if you are using both the data and management interfaces. Enter IP routes for networks or hosts that are not available through this HyperIP's default gateway. Specify the interface associated with this route in the drop-down, then enter the destination address, netmask, and gateway. To add the route now, check the immediate box. Add the route. Verify the route is installed in the right frame output. Repeat for additional routes. Check and execute any restarts. Sites, intercepts, and routes should be configured in all HyperIPs before continuing to the verification portion of this video. The HyperIPs should be able to communicate with each other after all configurations are implemented. To check that they are communicating, select Display HyperIP State in the Services drop-down menu and click Service Apply. You should see the HyperIP sessions are active. Any state other than active indicates the HyperIPs are not ready to move traffic. If the sessions do not come alive after a minute, check for any pending restarts as well as your site and IP route configurations on both HyperIPs associated with this session. Also verify the HyperIP interfaces are on the proper virtual switch. Run segment size tests to determine an appropriate setting for your network. Navigate to the Diagnostic Commands page. Select the remote site in the Target drop-down menu. Set megabytes to pass as 10 times your bandwidth schedule setting. I set my bandwidth schedule to 20 megabits per second, so I will use 200 megabytes per pass. Each pass of this test should take about 90 seconds, for a total test time of approximately 15 minutes. You can view the results by clicking Show Seg Results. In a non-impeded network, the passes should all take approximately the same amount of time and show similar speed results. If this is the case, leave the site seg size at the default setting. If the test looks like it is hung or speeds are dropping substantially, you can stop seg test and use the bytes size of the highest bandwidth pass as the site seg size. To modify the site seg size, go to the Site Edit Import page. Edit the remote site information. Change 32768 to the new seg size. If the best rate was achieved with 32,000, leave seg size at the default 32768. Typically, a network that allows fragmented packets will use 32768 and 1300 if fragments are not allowed. If fragments are not allowed and you are using jumbo frames of 9,000 bytes, use 8880 for the segment size. Click Site Apply and confirm the changes. If the segment size was set smaller, additional site tuning may be necessary. Navigate to the Advanced Config page. Select the remote site in the Tuning Parameters drop-down menu. Set the top parameter, max M to wait, to 1. In the second box, set min B to send to 65400. These two parameters will hold data for 1 millisecond or until 65,400 bytes have been received. The second from the bottom parameter is buff-o-lim. Buff-o-lim is the maximum number of HyperIP transport packets that can be outstanding. Set this parameter to 10,000. Click Set Site Params. Follow the same process to configure the remainder of your HyperIPs. Make one last check of pending restarts on all HyperIPs and execute any restarts that are pending. The HyperIP session should show active after all configurations are implemented. You've just learned how to define your HyperIP sites, define intercepts for your network traffic, configure routes and bandwidth schedule, and verify the HyperIPs are ready to move traffic. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you for watching this video.